Good afternoon and good morning in Western Canada. Welcome to IPAC's webinar on Canada's GBA Plus framework in a post-pandemic world, issues, tensions, and paths forward. It's my pleasure to be drawing attention to an excellent article on the topic of GBA Plus framework in a post-pandemic world, issues, tensions, and paths forward by Anna Cameron and Dr. Lindsay Tedds, which appeared in the March 2023 issue of the journal Canadian Public Administration. Today, we are also going to hear reflections from a discussant, Deputy Minister Frances McRae, and questions from you, the audience, who have joined us today. My name is Evert Lindquist, and I'm hosting today's webinar in my capacity as editor of Canadian Public Administration, the scholarly journal of the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. The journal showcases applied research on a variety of public administration, governance, and public policy issues. Today, I'll be facilitating our discussion from the traditional and unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples, on whose traditional territory the members of IPAC Victoria work and live, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. This acknowledgement has special resonance today as we consider how GBA Plus analysis meshes with recognizing intersectionality considerations. We have a great panel for you today. First, let me introduce the two authors of the article. Anna Cameron is a research associate at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and holds an MA from the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She's worked for a variety of nonprofit, advocacy, think tank organizations, as well as government, and has recently focused on using gender and intersectional analysis to understand policy challenges such as poverty reduction and social services provisions. Her research has informed the work of the BC Basic Income Expert Panel and the National Action Plan on Violence Against Women and Gender-Based Violence. Dr. Lindsay Tedds is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Calgary and scientific director of fiscal and economic policy at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. She's worked for and provided advice for the Government of Canada, municipal government, and served on the BC Expert Panel on Basic Income and the Government of Canada's Task Force on Women in the Economy. She has undertaken research on an impressive range of policy topics, too numerous to detail here, and she's an expert commentator and public educator. Our discussant today will be Frances McRae, Deputy Minister of Women and Gender Equality Canada. Prior to taking on this role, Frances served as Chief Administrative Officer at the RCMP and as Assistant Deputy Minister, Small Business and Marketplace Services at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or ISED. While at ISED, Ms. McRae worked with national and regional business organizations and stakeholders to support more equitable access to programs, services, and financing to start and grow their businesses. This included supporting entrepreneurs facing barriers to economic participation, such as Indigenous peoples, women, racialized Canadians, and LGBTQ2S+ business owners, cooperatives, and social enterprises. So that's going to be our panel today. And here's how we will proceed. Anna and Lindsay will deliver a 20-minute presentation, thereabouts, and then I will invite Deputy Minister McRae to provide her remarks. And then Lindsay and Anna will have a brief opportunity to reply. Then you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will monitor them and post questions to the panel. We have about an hour, and we will end just properly before the hour. We are also providing a list of articles on gender equality, GBA plus, and intersectional analysis in the chat, along with links which have appeared in the journal. So now, over to you, Anna and Lindsay.
And I had to remember to unmute myself. Sorry. That's the second time already. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, everybody, it's so pleased that this has been organized so we can present a piece that has been recently published in the journal. You know, this piece was sort of in the making for, as maybe all academics can understand, for about 8 years before we finally got it into a space where we submitted it to a journal. And that's because there was in fact a journey behind my shift into this area. As Evert mentioned, I work in a lot of different areas, you know, all the way from municipal finance to tax policy and intersectionality. So where my interest in this came was actually in 2015 during the federal election, when the Liberals put in their platform that they were going to elevate GBA plus in terms of the policy work that the federal government was going to be doing. And as somebody who works in public policy, that's when I sort of went, I got to learn about this as an economist, where I didn't have a lot of background information on it. And so I started a journey that has ended up in what I think is a really interesting area, which is about rethinking our public policy frameworks to make sure that we are tackling the root origins of inequality. Economists typically only focus on income inequality. And what we're trying to do is move that discussion forward even more so that we can understand how the market system actually, when people of different identities interact with the market system, they are not treated the same as white men who tend to dominate the economics discipline. So this has not been well absorbed into the economics framework. And it's not like I'm not the only one working in this space, but from a gendered perspective and from a Canadian perspective, I would definitely be, you know, one of the few economists taking this very seriously. So we had our first opportunity to apply some of our thinking and knowledge in my work on the BC Basic Income Panel, which was a 3-year expert panel where we were looking into basic income and income supports and how best to support people. But then also when the pandemic hit, and as a mom of a young child, it became pretty obvious that our entire system and our public policy process and our politicians really didn't understand how different people were living that pandemic experience. And that led to a report that has been published by the Royal Society of Canada, and which was recently given an honorable mention for the Purvis Prize. So that's sort of the background of where this research comes from. And so I will turn it over to Anna to talk about, sorry, Anna, my mouse. Thank you.
Yeah, so in Canada, considerations of inequality, particularly from a gender perspective, have been raised and even integrated in policymaking for some time. But as Lindsay noted, since 2015, with this most recent government, what we've seen is sort of a reinvigoration of efforts. And so we have commitments to gender parity in cabinet. We have the first woman finance minister. We have a so-called feminist budget and some big policy moves in areas like childcare. We've also seen status of Women Canada lifted to a full department. And of course, one effect of this has been increased focus on gender-based analysis plus as a tool for what some call transformative policy. And it's really against this backdrop that the global public health crisis really underscored and reinforced a need for questions of diversity and equality to inform policymaking. So this paper really starts from that point and asks the broad question, is GBA plus fit for purpose? Can it really help us achieve the transformative turn in policy that many of us believe this moment sort of demands? So taking this broad question as a starting point, in this paper, we do or try to do 4 things. You can hit to the next slide, Lindsay, if you want. So first, we want to understand the framework's foundations, both politically and conceptually. So to do so, we trace the history and the evolution of GBA+. Next, we ask whether GBA Plus has been effective. And in asking this question, we find some key limitations. Then in thinking about how these critiques can be addressed, we draw on critical feminist, intersectional, and even some post-structuralist methods to adapt the framework. And then we end by showing how embracing ideas of intersectionality and power can really help us reorient policy and GBA plus towards more transformative ends. So GBA Plus has a long history that dates all the way back to the Women's Bureau within the Department of Labor in the 1950s. But it's really helpful to think of 4 phases of gender policy in Canada. So we have the women's state phase, then disassembly, moving into mainstreaming, and then intersectionality, which is sort of where we are now. So in the years following the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, so in the 70s, we see the emergence of this multi-pronged women's state architecture, including a minister and an office for the coordinator of the status of women, women's policy agencies like the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and even a women's program that's tasked with funding organizations nationwide. But by the 90s, this architecture really starts to be disassembled due to funding cuts and lack of institutional support. And of course, this greatly impacts its role in power. Almost simultaneously, though, we have this momentous Beijing Declaration in 1995. We have global commitments to gender mainstreaming. And of course, we have Canada's implementation of its own commitment through a federal plan for gender equality and the creation of this tool, GBA plus. And then in 2011, we finally see the formal emergence of intersectionality in this space with the introduction of GBA plus. And what's really important to emphasize here is how this approach has shifted across the phases and how this impacts how we approach transformative policy goals. So this multi-pronged women's state approach, where gender considerations and gender politics can actually impact and contest policymaking through multiple channels and modalities, it actually stands in contrast to this expert bureaucratic approach that we see with the turn to GBA and GBA plus. So in this new technocratic approach, gender, yes, it becomes mainstreamed, but it's mainstreamed within dominant modes of bureaucratic analysis, which of course privilege things like neutrality and rationality, efficiency, fiscal measures of success. And because of this, it really gets depoliticized. And so even as we've improved upon this approach in the past 25 years, responding to multiple audits, enacting cross-departmental action plans, reframing training, doubling down on intersectionality, we're still finding ourselves within this sort of technocratic paradigm. And this perspective is really important for exploring some of the limitations of GBA plus, which we'll turn to now. So back to you, Lindsay.
Okay, so I'll just go through some of the practical challenges and just to lay this out, Anna and I do work with federal departments as well as provincial and municipal departments. And we work in a space that is traditionally not thought of as a women's policy state. And that includes, fiscal policy and tax policy. And as Anna said, this idea of neutrality, these are things that are highly problematic in terms of really reaching the transformative objectives that we're trying to achieve. So when we look at the practical challenges, what we see is uptake is a problem. It's siloed and inconsistent across government departments. We've come across some departments in global affairs that are really at a leading edge, whereas others, like in ISED, are really struggling with understanding how to think about GBA plus. We know that there is a limited capacity to conduct GBA plus, and that is not helped by the fact that policy and public admin schools are not teaching this as a rigorous methodology. We focus more on either quantitative aspects or, qualitative research is defined by focus groups and things like that. So there's a lack of training ground, and so when new civil servants enter, they just struggle with understanding all of this. We also see it's often applied as a checklist. And so, like in a Treasury Board submission process, it's sort of done. Yes, we're going to attach it. Reminds me when I worked at Treasury Board, and risk-based management. You always had to have a framework for it, but nobody understood why. But you had to check that box in order for your Treasury Board submission to go forward. And more often than not, it's conducted as an afterthought as opposed to being done right at the start and throughout the whole policy process. There seems to be a weak understanding of core concepts, and particularly what intersectionality means. How do you operationalize that? How do you think about it? And how do you move beyond just considering identity and, presenting what I find quite unsatisfying, which is, essentially pivot tables showing the difference between men and women as though that's intersectional analysis, and it's not. There's definitely data gaps and misconceptions about data. While data is important, it is not the only thing that you can use in order to do intersectional analysis. And yet we often see civil servants saying to us, well, I can't do GBA plus because I don't have data. That's not true. You can do this without, quantitative data. There's lots of information that you can bring to bear on these problems. And there's a real lack of engagement across policy disciplines, including my own, which is economics. Economics does not take this seriously, and a lot of policy experts come from economics. And GBA plus is usually framed as a advocacy approach as opposed to rigorous analysis. I get this from my male colleagues. It's not, it's not a real framework, and that is completely not true. So with that, I will turn it back over to Anna to talk to you about the conceptual critique and what launched this paper.
Yeah, so in addition to sort of those practical criticisms, we've identified 4 key conceptual critiques of GBA+. So the first is a weak integration of intersectionality, what some people have called a co-optation of intersectionality. And this is where applications are still sort of gender first and additive. So it's a prioritization of sex and gender as the analytical foundation. And then other identity factors are just added in sort of as secondary considerations, if at all, and sort of only to the extent that they intersect sex and gender. And this was really clear in the flower visual, which until very, very recently emphasized sex and gender at the core. And of course, improvements have been made recently, but problematic readings of intersectionality continue to be reproduced in analyses, I'd say particularly in the budget. The second critique is an insufficient attention to power structures and the socio-political context. There's a failure to ground our exploration of inequalities in power relations. So the focus remains on things like intersecting identity factors, how they make people vulnerable, rather than the systems of domination and the processes of differentiation that actually give identity meaning and through which differences are actually constructed. So even in the updated flower, which moves away from this strictly additive approach, there's still no indication of how contextual factors and systems and institutions come to bear upon identity. And relatedly, there's a failure to question how systems and institutions are shaped by power and actually complicit in reproducing social hierarchies, meaning that government and policy making actually become exculpated as sites of oppression. And in fact, there's a depoliticization of inequality. So again, this technocratic approach, framing inequality as a problem of information, we just need to get more facts. GBA Plus is a tool for systematically gathering data, conducting research, rather than launching into an actual social critique, which is what we need to do if we're to address some of these big systemic problems. The third critique is the fixation on only the instrumental qualities of policy. So policy is framed as something that's just acting upon an identified problem to solve it, reinforcing this idea that there's just this causal link between policies and inequality. And we really need to extend our thinking in this area to account for the fact that policy is also creative or productive. So we need to ask what sort of logics and what sort of assumptions are informing policymaking, what discursive possibilities, what social relations, and what sort of subjects are enabled and foreclosed or created as a result of policy. And finally, there's a misreading of identity where it's presented as the sum of these disconnected but really concrete parts that exist sort of completely free of context and power. So identity is conceptualized as something fixed, static, something that we just have, rather than something that is very emergent and dynamic, something that's constructed socially through social relations, something that's a reflection of discourses and policy practices. And ultimately, failing to see identity in this way, again, leads to a depoliticization and a framing of identity as inalterable. So it's either an affliction or a privilege. Back to you, Lindsay.
Great. And so we took all of this together and including the original representation from non-governmental groups in terms of, power structures. And we revisualized what is meant by intersectionality, to really get at what we're talking about, which is, the wage flower diagram leads you to start with identity. And we say that's not where you start. You start outside with the systems and logics of domination and oppression. Then you have to think about sites of oppression, domination, normalization, control, and then how all of that interacts with identity. So we're trying to make it much more clear that you got to start outwards, not inwards, and move outwards. And that really reinforces why you need to do this. And think about these issues right from the start through everything that you do, so that you can start confronting where the real problems are, which is as Anna said, it's endemic in our society, right? So when you think about a sort of, a traditional kind of approach of thinking, I have to read a lot of budgets and I talk to tax policy all the time, right? And it can be very, very unsatisfying when I think in the last budget, they talked about capital gains taxation, and their representation of GBA plus was more men than women actually claim capital gains, and therefore an increase in a capital gains tax affects men more than women. What we really need to be talking about, though, is why do we see such a gendered difference in capital gains, and how to think about what we are trying to achieve with tax policy to overcome that misdistribution of a very, very valuable asset that is given tax preference, right? So you can see how, something as simple as that, if you reframe it in a different way, rather than starting with identity, but talking about systems, you start thinking of your analysis differently, you start thinking of policy differently, and you start thinking about how is it that you want to confront these inequalities in society. So I know that's a sort of a brief overview, but we really want to make sure that you get at this idea that identity is interacting with these systems, but it's the systems that we're trying to dismantle. We're not trying to actually change identity. So you have to think about it slightly in a slightly different way. Whoops. My mouse. Sorry, Anna.
There you are. You're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the second part of our intervention is a bit of an amended process, which we think can maybe serve as an implementation resource to ensure that public servants can sort of grasp these fundamental principles underpinning GBA plus and actually translate these understandings in practice. So to adapt the process, we gave each step a bit of an altered focus, and then attached some guiding questions by drawing on the three critical frameworks that we have up here on the slide. And these guiding questions mirror what's already done in the GBA plus approach, but They reflect a bit of a change in focus with the hope that we can bring to the fore these notions of power and intersectionality and make them clearer and easier to apply. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give a little bit of a peek into what some of these changes look like and how they might be helpful. So the first thing I've highlighted here in relation to the first step of the GBA plus process relates to this question of identifying the problem at hand. And generally, this is framed as a basic question in GBA plus material. So what is the issue? And I think without further context, people take this quite literally. But to really get at what this is asking, which is more than that, we've included deeper clarifying questions. So how is the problem represented? How is it represented in government texts, in public discourse, in policy discourse? And when you start to ask these questions, if you dig deep enough, it gets at both the multifaceted and political nature of most policy issues, as well as the ways in which we talk or think about a policy, construct a range of viable options. So even if we're not explicitly attempting to do so. And then if we move into challenging assumptions, the next phase, we double down on this, again, through a focus on discourses, framings, and representations. And here we really want to get people thinking about policy silences as well. So what's left out? What are we accepting at face value or as unproblematic? How does what we say about an issue create certain target groups or policy subjects? So how are our ideas of things like productivity, mothering, citizenship? How are these represented in advance through how we're framing questions and problems? We've also added in some clear statements about power and right from the start, sorry. So really to embed it from the top of the analysis. If you pop over the next slide, Lindsay, and as we move on to this key phase of gathering facts, one of our key priorities was to ensure that analyses which move beyond just data and quantitative analysis are really encouraged. And we wanted to challenge the evidence binary of sort of quantitative data and then data obtained through consultation, and to ask or to encourage asking whether there's other forms of evidence or other forms of reasoning we can draw on to build out an evidence base. So can we be a bit more creative in analysis? What about different conceptual frames, historical analysis, storytelling, logical reasoning? We also include in this phase and in the option development phase questions that get at key feminist and intersectional considerations. So there's an explicit mentioning of racism, of settler colonialism, of care, of this question of the mediation of state, family, market relations, ideas about rights and justice versus duties and care. And then finally, we want to bring a critical lens to metrics of success and outcome measurement, sort of encouraging the analyst to reflect critically on what success means, what success should mean, whose metrics will be used in gauging success, and really to challenge this idea of outcome reporting in general. Like, can outcomes be challenged? Might they be contested? And what is the purpose? What is the material gain for people in having so much focus on evaluation? So I'll stop there with that. And I think Lindsay, you'll just wrap up.
Yeah, and I'll be very quick here. I mean, it's important to acknowledge that there's been a lot of change in prioritizing GBA plus. And it is in a very important movement forward. But there's a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. And I think, you know, we as academics can help sort of advance this movement forward. We can be the ones that are able to do, you know, deep dives, not only into the theory, but also do some really interesting work. But it's also incumbent on everybody within, you know, the federal government and provincial governments and municipal governments and so on to really take this issue seriously and to ensure that we actually are transforming our policy frameworks to achieve outcomes, better outcomes for people. And so with that, I'll wrap it up and I'll turn it over. Okay, now I don't know how to stop sharing. Sorry, I've lost my screens. Turn it over to Francis for commentary. There we go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna and Lindsay. Excellent presentation. Now over to you, Francis.
That's great. Thank you so much. First of all, I do want to say that, you know, particularly in this month of Indigenous History Month, it's important for us to acknowledge where we are. I am coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in the National Capital Region, and very proud to say that our office is located right at the Chaudière Falls, which are so important to the Indigenous people of our region. So, you know, maybe I'll just say a couple of context pieces, sort of where Lindsay started. How did we get here in terms of, you know, our work at Women and Gender Equality Canada? And then maybe just a few reactions to the article, and then some of what Lindsay and Anna have said, and then, you know, we can open it up. So just the first thing, you know, Anna did a really good job kind of tracing the kind of history of you know, the status of women organization into what I now lead as Deputy Minister, which is Women and Gender Equality Canada. So it was created in December 2018 as a department. So we're not even 5 years old. You know, we always played a role. Women and Gender Equality is very small. You will probably all know that there are about 300,000 federal public servants, give or take a couple of 100,000, couple of tens of thousands. Women and Gender Equality Canada is about 434 people. So anything we do in terms of working on gender-based analysis on the kind of supporting the system has got to be playing a system role, right? We've got to be working with our central agency colleagues. We're not a central agency, so we have tools, we support people. We convene, but really the key tools, you know, Lindsay mentioned one, which is Treasury Board submissions. This is a Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada role, right? Privy Council office manages memoranda to cabinet. The Department of Finance manages budgets. So, you know, the role we play is with our colleagues, and, you know, Minister Ian, who is my minister, has been very clear on that as well. So I'll go now to her. Her mandate letter, which was given to her in December 2021, asks her to work with a number of colleagues to enhance, the words are enhance, the GBA tools we have to better reflect Canadians' lives and real experiences. So essentially what that is, and it's working with a number of different colleagues, you know, on diversity and inclusion, on disability inclusion, on rural issues, on issues of, well, we have 2 LGBTQI+ issues in my department. So, you know, we certainly work on that. You know, whole range of folks who actually have different pieces that, you know, Lindsay talked about, the silos. What our job is to work with those folks to be able to enhance our approach to this. And I would tell you that, you know, the criticisms of GBA plus that you have raised in the article and in other pieces, these are all valid. And these are things that we have heard as well, not in quite such an kind of, I think, a precise kind of methodological way, but you know, the Auditor General of Canada has done 3 reports. You mentioned them in the article, 3 reports, 3 different times, about 3 or 4 years apart over the last 10 years, saying we essentially have fairly, you know, similar ways of doing this work that we had kind of 10 years ago, right? So 3 different reports, we've tabled 3 different action plans. Those action plans have been moved along. And here we are, we still have, you know, some fairly important work to do to enhance this tool. I would be remiss as well if I did not mention the recent report of a Senate Standing Committee that I know that Lindsay and Anna are familiar with, which is the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology. And they made a number of recommendations, very very much along the lines of what you're hearing today. So the disparities are there. I'll just, start with that. The disparities are there. We know that Canadians are not accessing, are not able to take advantage of government programs and services. They're not benefiting in the same ways. We talked a little bit about data. There is more and more availability of disaggregated data. I would point anyone who has not seen it yet to the first annual report that Statistics Canada has prepared on their work on disaggregated data. There's a lot. There's more to do, much more to do, but we have much more available than we had. The question is how we apply it. Are we applying it in a more holistic way? Or are we still, applying these various identity factors and kind of packaging it up and dealing with that separately? So how do we do that to reflect real lives? As Anna talked about, challenging the assumptions. How do we know what we know? Who told us that? Who didn't? Who wasn't in the room? Who wasn't able to participate? Why? Who's accessing our programs? Why do they have access? Who's benefiting from those who's getting through the programs to get the supports? Why are others not? So asking ourselves these really systemic questions, I think, are a really big part of where we want to go next. I also want to point out, and you didn't talk about this, Anna and Lindsay, but around the world, the truth is that Canada's approach on gender-based analysis is a lot further ahead than almost any other country. We get asked all the time to go and teach people what we know. We are not perfect. We have a lot of work to do. But it's important to remember that we have an opportunity not only to raise the bar here in Canada, we have an opportunity to actually really help others raise the bar around the world, because they do come to us. And I know that, you've seen that, Lindsay and Anna, I'm sure, in your work. So, we sometimes forget that, we are leaders in the world. We have a lot to do. Thankfully, we have academics interested in this issue who help us and who have great ideas and really practical ways of looking at this. But that's not the situation in almost every other country in the world. And so that's a really important piece that I wanted to mention. I think maybe a couple of other points just on the concept of intersectionality. We were talking a little bit about this as we were joining the call, but the question of systems and structures and institutions, these are fundamental to our future approaches around enhancing GBA, because, I'll give you an example of something that I worked on not all that long ago. So when I was at Women and Gender Equality, when I was at Innovation, Science and Economic Development, we developed the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy. And we didn't have a lot of information about what was really going on. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we didn't have a lot of data. Interestingly, banks didn't keep a lot of data on who they give loans to and who they don't and how that system works. Ran into the same thing when we were doing the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund. So what did we do? We said, okay, you can say someone's a woman entrepreneur, but it matters. It matters the lived, how you look at the lived context, right? So a woman entrepreneur who's living in rural Nova Scotia, who has a disability, is a different person and has different barriers than a woman entrepreneur who's Indigenous, who lives off reserve in Alberta, right? That's just clear. People's context matters. So what was going on is people in those situations would have different barriers to growing their businesses. That's the bottom line. They had different barriers. So if we were going to deal with this objective we had of helping women grow their businesses, We had to deal with the issues that they were facing wherever they were. Right? And that is what we did. We said, okay, you tell us what your issues and barriers are. What is preventing you from doing what you want in your business? And we're going to have a look at that. We're going to make sure that whatever we design is flexible enough to deal with the barriers that you personally face with all the things that are part of you, including your context, including the discrimination you would face at an institution, including, possibly the fact that, you may not own a home and therefore you will not have the same ability to get financing, right? Why is that? There are reasons why people don't own homes. And it's not all because, what may be commonly known as, people being able to save money. That's not it. And so, taking this kind of, I take the point about looking outward at the powers and at the structures and institutions. The way we often do policy is, what do we want? Who do we want to benefit? Who do we believe? What is our objective here, right? What is our objective? And then what are the issues that people face in terms of their ability to move in the direction that they want to move in? So, for us, it is definitely, I like that concept of the root causes. It is the intersection of political identity, systemic features that means we've got to kind of re-question how we look at our policy work. We need to make those things visible and surface them. If there's an issue with access to our programs, it's not by, doing better outreach that we should, reach people. It's going to be by looking at the program and saying, what is it about those programs? How are they designed that has an inherent, that keeps people away? Why are they designed that way? And we do need to kind of look at those, big systems. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do as we think through the enhancement. Maybe the last point I'll make is just accountability. There are some who believe that we should have one big report, and your report should, Women and Gender Equality Canada should issue a report card, and we should, tell everybody, rank them all or whatever, right? There are, some people who have these kinds of ideas. We need to embed this in the system. I talked to you about the fact that we have, 434 people. I have no ability to report on other people. My view is we need to raise the bar, make people accountable for public reporting as part of their initiative. So if I'm reporting on the women's entrepreneurship strategy, I should have to report on who benefited, what we did about systems, what we know about what the barriers they were facing, and how we handled that. And then what impact it made, right? I should be able to report on that. And my belief is that transparency is a big factor. Sometimes the easiest way to get people focused on accountability is to shine a light on performance, to shine a light on it. And people then have to be accountable for the way that they get questioned on these issues. And to me, that's a significant piece of the puzzle as we go forward. So I will stop there. I'm really looking forward to so many more things that we could talk about, but I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, well, you've touched upon a number of interesting points, Frances. We do have a couple of questions from Alex. There are three big questions, so let's just tackle one. And I think given the time constraints that we have now, incisive answers might be required. Let's just go to the first one from Alex. Can you speak to the adjunct complementary analysis, such as social determinants of health, including economic outcomes, that can be used to bolster arguments about the need of an SPA plus lens or CBA plus lens when doing policy analysis. So that's the first question.
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at that one. Certainly what we see is in the health discipline, whether that be in academia or otherwise, that this idea of this interrelationship between systems of power and identity is further along in terms of the frameworks that are used. And social determinants of health is precisely this sort of idea. So the thing that we're trying to do is, instead of having multiple different frameworks and frameworks for different kinds of identity, what we're trying to say is that this is all encompassed under the framework of intersectionality, so that you don't have to, learn how to apply it in all of these different contexts. It's the same thing moving forward. Anna, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Just that I think that, like, you're absolutely right that those frameworks are complementary, and for me, the key way in which they're complementary is this focus on systems rather than an individual sort of, role in their health. How do all of these external factors create contexts in which people are deemed unhealthy? So, I think maybe, and I kind of want to respond to the second question, if that's okay.
Sure, it's fine, yeah.
I think that using sort of adjacent or complementary frameworks like that, which might not be as sort of politicized, can be a way to advance similar work in a way that, say, is not necessarily caught up in or branded as wokeism or identity politics. But to that point, I think that, like, there's three things that I'd say. One, there's already barriers in the system, like with a government that wants to self-brand as feminist. There's already barriers in the system to doing this sort of work. It's already a fraught process. It's always been. So I think that's always going to exist. Two, I think that we can tackle this by ensuring that we have a civil service that actually understands how to do this type of critical analysis, whether or not they're told to do it. And this gets back to, like, how are we training people in policy schools? Are we just focusing sort of on stats and economics and cost benefit, or are we giving them sort of a breadth of tools? And are we hiring people who have expertise beyond economics expertise? Are we hiring historians? Are we hiring philosophers? I might be biased in that direction, but I think that there's vital things that these disciplines can contribute to policy analysis. And then I'd also say that there's some strategies for refocusing on systems rather than identity that we've spoken about that can actually move us away from identity politics, because the political parties and their leaders, which may speak out against identity politics, they often have key interests sort of at the intersection of things like class, things like rurality, and might want to speak to how we can adjust systems to create equality or overcome inequality in their various constituencies. So stop answering that question now, but
yeah, I have a follow-on question, because I do teach, I will be using your article in my classes in the future, in part because it really complements things I try to do in the introductory classes and also final courses in our MPA program. But I've been relying on frameworks from historical institutional analysis, policy feedback theory, multiple streams analysis, and also advocacy coalition framework, which all are systems approaches. You look in particular policy domains, but you step back, look at the whole system and over time, not just the last 5 years, but go back 20 or 30 years and look at key historical junctures and explicitly model values. So the question I have for you is, so I think this is just really good analysis, and it's really sharp the way you've created a tool, right? Enhanced this tool for public servants to use. What I'm wondering, and I'm thinking of you, Lindsay, in your previous role as a Treasury Board analyst, I'm thinking about the time and culture that one needs to do this within these complex systems. And is it a matter, like, you can't expect one analyst to do something that's a big reaching analysis, right? But is there something about building a culture within different departments so that more people are already thinking this way before they go to do a more selective analysis? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, there needs to be a culture. And when we were testifying in front of the Senate committee, one of the things that we said was that a really, really important thing is for the, I can't remember, the clerk of the Privy Council, leading that this is this is what we expect of our bureaucrats, right? So the clerk of the Privy Council actually has a big role to play in establishing that culture. But you also are going to face culture problems based off of disciplinary structures, right? And mine's it, right? So you can look at Finance and Treasury Board as two places where you're going to find a lot of economists. And despite the fact that, you know, we have all of these large annexes to budgets, the analysis is not intersectional analysis, right? Our budgets are very much a checklist type approach, and that represents the culture. The culture in finance is data, neutrality, economic efficiency, without really fully understanding that all of those things are really dependent on this, you know, the structures of power and your identity and how all of these things intersect. So there's a lot to overcome. I would also say one of the things I'm very also dissatisfied with the budgets as well, and it gets at culture, is that they analyze everything. Again, like a checklist approach, there's 800 things in the budget. Here's a pivot table. We've done our GBA and that's it. I would be much more satisfied if they took the 10 big items and actually started at the end of a budget, moving that forward and thinking about why did we do this? What issues do we have to think about? You know, and we're just not seeing that from finance. And so, and again, it just represents the culture. Pivot table, check, data, check, not worry about systems like, I don't know, the Income Tax Act is not gender neutral. Well, anyway, so, you know, and I don't know if you have anything, but I think we've got to stop with this superficial analysis, pick some really big items and really dig in. And remember, every time we do this, we get better at it. So I worry about, Francis, what you said in terms of a report card, because I don't think that actually supports people in developing this skill and learning by doing.
I agree. And that's why I say I don't think a report card is actually the answer.
No, not at all.
My point. Like, that's not the answer. And I know a lot of people out there think it is, but it's not. Just before Anna comments, I just want to say a couple of things. One is just in terms of culture. Like, I would tell you that the public service has come an awfully long way. And this is not unrelated to the clerk's call for action on anti-racism and discrimination, right? The public service is changing the way that it actually internalizes diversity. And you've got to know what lived experience feels like. You got to know the question, you know, you got to know what you don't know, right? And so this is not separate from the public service become a much more diverse organization. And I just want to make a point, and maybe somebody could put this in the chat, but you know, the UN Women has come up with a really interesting guide, a toolkit on intersectionality. And what they did is they worked with the UN partnership on the rights of persons with disabilities. And they had a very practical set of of tools to actually have people internalize this in the policy process. So, you know, very similar to the kinds of questions that you are asking in your paper. So there are toolkits out there. People are moving on this way of thinking. And maybe just the last thing I would say on this is, you know, when we think about leadership, you know, I use the words raise the bar. Everyone, we've got to raise the bar for everyone across the system. It has to become an expectation that when you go to these places to access your authorities and access your funds and, you know, get policy proposals funded, that the definition of what good looks like is better. That's where we have to get. Otherwise, you don't get your stuff. You can't move it.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, we're going to, the person who had the first word is now going to have the last word. Anna.
On that culture piece, I guess I just had two small things, sort of what you were saying, Francis, about the diversity of the public service. I think one, diversity is ensuring that our gender and intersectionality experts aren't just working on social policy files. They're working across departments and particularly in the central agencies. And I think too, you know, across the public service federally and provincially and even within municipal systems, you're seeing more and more designated hires, and that's great. We want to ensure that our civil service reflects, you know, the diversity of the population. But what I would pay attention to is where these hires are happening. Are they only, again, in social issue agencies, or are they in finance? Are they in defense? Are they at Treasury Board? Are they in planning departments? Are they in transportation? Like to me, that's what progress will really look like when we get everybody into those roles, not just working on what are already, in my opinion, marginalized policy files.
Well, thank you very much. That's we really could have spent another hour on you know, the many considerations that your article has opened up. Lindsay has pointed out to other articles that and reports that the two of you have done, and also with other colleagues of Lindsay. One of the very nice things about your article is that it provides a nice survey of the literature. We've put some links just in our journal alone over the last few years. We have had several articles and notes in this area. It's really been interesting to watch the sophistication of this approach. And the thing that is wonderful about your piece is it really bridges, you know, it takes the big picture questions and perspectives and then lands them into a much more fulsome framework. I want to thank each of you for your contributions today. It was really, really interesting. I also want to take this opportunity to thank IPAC for supporting this webinar and showcasing your article, for Aaron Bellwood at IPAC for setting this all up for us, and also for the managing editor of the journal, Christy Paddock, who really helps move along everything that the journal has done. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today. There will be a recording of this posted in due course. Pass it along. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to get back in touch with us. So thank you again, Anna, Lindsay, and Francis. It was a pleasure to host this webinar. Goodbye.
Yes, and thank you very much, Francis, for your comments.
Thank you to both of you. We really love the ideas.
Great, thanks. Okay, all right, bye everybody.
Bye.
And if anybody who attended wants to reach out, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only Lindsay Tedds in the world.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.